a PhD student at the Division of History and also part of the Streams team. I will just go over a few practicalities before I hand over to the panelists. So I just wanted to mention, for those of you who are new now to this event, is that you can ask questions through the Q&A icon on the bottom of the Zoom window, and you can also introduce yourself through the chat. And other than that, I'm going to leave it to the panelists to introduce themselves and what they will talk about.
Alrighty, can you guys hear me? Yes, wonderful. Yeah. So there's an expression in Norwegian called jumping after Wirkola, which kind of describes the feeling after having to jump after the legendary ski jumper Bjørn Wirkola. That's a little bit how I'm feeling right now after this wonderful talk by Dipesh Chakrabarti. Anyway, I am Emil. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Oslo. I work on the origins of scientific climate future making practices in the 1970s. And my colleagues and I, we all work in time studies in one way or another. When you work with time, there's this truism that we've all basically encountered at one point. In one of my first meetings with my supervisor, I remember him going, you know, the weird thing about time is that it can't really be represented. You know, like space, it's entirely different. You can map it out, you can be within it, but time, you know, time in this conception was this entirely different, abstract, intangible thing. But in my research, as well as in the research of my fellow PhD candidates at the Lifetimes Project, which we are part of in Oslo, it arose that kind of understanding the sort of the specific and bewildering sort of temporal dynamics in play in our source material has been really key. It's felt very imperative to sort of find where the time is in our sources to make it concrete and graspable in order to move ahead at all. And this is surprisingly difficult to find analytical frameworks to do. There's some notable examples, and if Professor Chakrabarti is still listening in, I really want to commend him for making such a serious effort to position human existence, human experiences against the revolving planet and its plethora of timescales. But apart from that, you know, historical approaches are surprisingly staid often and rigid when it comes to how you tackle time itself. Even less helpful is this kind of platitude that you meet in a lot of general social theory, the idea that everything is contemporary or that space has gained dominion over time or things like that. So amongst ourselves as PhDs at the Lifetimes Project, we wondered whether the fact that we're all working with environmental issues of time somehow has something to do with the challenges we were experiencing working with time, seeing as environments really do pit the human and the non-human, the material and the semiotic together in this sludge we have to coexist in. And so these were the origins of our original Streams proposal. If this were a physical meeting today in a room, we would be tackling this question experimentally. We'd be standing in a circle with all the participants having brought tangible time into the room and sort of devices with which that materialized time, whatever that would be, could be accessed. So rather than sort of claiming to know how we deal with these times, we wanted to exhibit the variety of approaches that are already there and kind of bring it into the room and try to have this kind of generative event where we could see what came out of it. Seeing as the Corona crisis occurred and this thing moved virtually, we figured that it would be really good to take this opportunity to kind of introduce the problematics that we are thinking about, and especially this truism that I began with. Is time really all that impossible, quote unquote, to grasp? So my colleague here at the University of Oslo, Leonor Bergesius, is here. to discuss, along with our special guest, Michelle Bastian, who is Senior Lecturer at the Edinburgh College of Art, which is a part of the University of Edinburgh. Michelle is a philosopher who's been pioneering environmentally embedded approaches to time for the better part of a decade. I hope you bear that, that seniority as a badge of honor, Michelle. At least we're very grateful that you can join us today. And our final...
I hadn't realized it was 10 years until you told me. So
there you go.
That was what I freaked out about it when you mentioned it before. But yeah.
Exactly.
It's been a pleasure to be able to do it for so long.
Certainly. And our final organizer, Stina Alling Jacobsen, she unfortunately couldn't make it today. And we're very sorry to miss her. And before we start properly, I just really want to encourage you all to add questions to the Q&A. And if you don't have questions, go in there and vote, because we really want to open this up to as many of you as possible. Now, Michelle, I was in a seminar you taught, and it appeared that you have a very strong opinion on this matter of time's supposed ungraspability.
Yeah, so I got myself into a bit of trouble by getting quite excited about that at the PhD seminar that we did. I think it was in April, was it? Or May, maybe. And so, yeah, I was just going to talk a little bit about why I was talking about that, I suppose. And I suppose one of the facetious answers to that question about why it kind of irritates me so much, I suppose, is the way everybody repeats the quote from Augustine endlessly. Whenever you read a paper about time, you'll get the quote from Augustine, which I will not requote just to save us from it, but hopefully you'll all know, I'm sure many will, about time being intangible, ungraspable, of it sort of becoming something that you can't explain or talk about once you start thinking about it. And I think it's quite interesting because that's it's a defamiliarization that any concept that you ask about will, that experience will occur of not knowing what it is when you start asking about it. What's love, what's hate, what's justice, what's truth, any of these kinds of things. It's sort of the nature of concepts that when you start looking at them more closely like this, they start evaporating a bit and you're not sure what they are or what they might mean. But why is it when it comes to time that we keep repeating this experience of defamiliarization over and over again, as if it tells us something fundamental about time more than any other kind of concept? And so I think I was starting to think about why it was that I just really wanted to push back against this and think about time as experienceable, as something that you can see, as something that you can feel, that it's not, and social concepts of time as something that you can feel as well, not just feelings of faster or slower or something being a long time away or a close time away, and sort of thinking about sort of more psychology of time. And there was a really interesting, I suppose one of the first experiences I had was when I was reading a book by Deborah Berg-Rose, which was talking about lessons that she'd been taught from her her teachers and the people that she worked with in Northern Australia, where I think it was Hobbles Donayari that she was talking about the past as being not something behind us, but something in front of us, actually, that we go towards the past and the future is behind us. And I remember reading that and feeling physically disoriented, feeling dizzy, actually, when I read that. And I thought it was very interesting that this social conception of time and what directionality we have in time was something actually in my body that gave me a sense of orientation in the world. And that when I had to think about it differently, I felt physically queasy and dizzy. And that was sort of this first inkling, I suppose, as time is something that we feel in our bodies, actually, beyond the kinds of thing I was talking about before. But then also we had really nice conversations at the Edinburgh Environmental Humanities Network that I'm part of, where we started a series called Unexpected Encounters with Deep Time. And we were talking about deep time as well as something that needs to be experienced, that is something that confronts you materially, for you to even get a sense of what it is. So there was a really nice paper by Ian Zen, it was a very, I don't think it's been cited all that much, but it's from a journal of teaching geography. where the author was just very adamant about how important it is in geography to take people to this scene of deep time, and that it's only when they see it and touch it and feel it that they can understand what this time is. So there was that work that we then did in that network. We ran a few seminars, and we've got a special issue came out thinking about deep time as something that you actually encounter in your everyday life, not this abstract concept. And then the other thread, I suppose, was particularly coming from working with Deborah Bird Rose's work, particularly the paper Multi-Species Knots of Ethical Time, where she talked about time as something that's made in relationship with others. So she's talking about flying foxes and eucalyptus trees, that sequence and synchrony were things made that were held within those physical relationships, and that when those relationships broke down, or there was extinction, or just a reduction of that, the time itself was gone. Time could die. So it became, so thinking about those different kinds of threads, I suppose, and all those different kinds of issues to really challenge this idea that is time, that is very problematic to just keep going back to Augustine and that problem of time being unexperienceable, intangible, particularly in comparison to space, which is usually where this comes up.
So there's almost a kind of obviousness to the tangibility of time for you then. So why is it that we there seems to be a tendency to more easily grasp for abstractions, large abstractions when it comes to time, history or period or something like that? Why has this criticism not really had a long history, or has it?
Well, I think it has done. It has done. It's just sort of different kinds of threads of it. So the Leibniz debates, and with Newton about whether or not time is a thing in itself or a characteristic of relationships and things. So it has been something that's been carrying on quite in lots of different kinds of ways, I suppose. So I'm not exactly sure why this intangible time has got preeminence. Sort of in preparation for this, one of the things I was looking up, I had remembered reading many times this idea that unlike space, time is immaterial, or space is concrete, time is ephemeral. And I had read that so many times I couldn't remember exactly where I was looking at it. But I suppose, if you look at Kant's sort of Immanuel Kant's discussion of time, I think that could provide a really good, not beginning point, but a really good place to go back to, where he talks about time as interior and space as exterior. And so his account is quite complicated. So he does actually say that both space and time, the intuitions of them are not empirical. But the division of this understanding of time is something that's internal, and space is external, viewable, sort of malleable, something that's laid out in front of us, and time is, something that's sort of a bit more untouchable, I suppose. That division that he's created seems to have been taken, maybe simplified from how he first described it, and run with, basically.
Can we associate any sort of agenda with dealing with time in the abstract?
Well, it's such a big question. I suppose my way into it is, I think if people have heard me talk before, you might have heard me say this, but I'll bring it up again. Carol Greenhouse's book On Moment's Notice, which I read during my PhD, which completely transformed how I thought about time. And her argument about what time is as an anthropologist, there was that time is she had a few different definitions, but one was that time is a theory, a tool for managing diversity. So that your conceptualization of time isn't just about things like the relationship between past, present, and future, or rhythm or speed or things like this, but actually the way time is defined, maybe as linear or circular, or whatever way you might want to define it, is a theory for how things belong together. So what things are included and what things might be excluded. So, you know, she talks about when you start looking at time that way, you can start pulling out lots of different kinds of threads. And you can see that linear time, for example, one of its rules of how things belong together is the theory of progress, so that difference is divided along a line, so that what is thought about as the most progressive, I suppose, is at the beginning is current, and everything else is, and everybody else is trailing along behind. So I think there is something at stake, you know, really very important thing at stake in how we conceptualize time. And so if we are conceptualizing time as abstract, intangible, then it helps us notice certain aspects of time while being able to ignore everything else going on around us, being able to ignore all the ways that we make time with each other, the kinds of ways we negotiate about time, the values we apply to time. You know, all of this political work that time does becomes that much harder to excavate if we think about it as this abstract, distant, intangible kind of thing that we don't really, you know, we can't really say what it is, and we can't really talk about it because we always just get into conundrums. You know, it sort of helps to keep obfuscating all this political work that it does actually, and social work and ethical work, all this kind of thing.
I guess a final thing that confuses me on this point is the point that is it Keith? His name is Birth. Sorry, in the regular sound of the cock, where he makes this argument about how timekeeping practices that were attuned to the regular sound of the cock crowing in the Middle Ages were a really key temporal, a really key means of timekeeping. But in the histories that have been written about it, about the early modern timekeeping practices, there's been so much more attention being paid to mechanistic means of timekeeping, such as the clock. So there seems to be this general tendency that the immediate experience of time is down prioritized.
Yeah. So Kevin Birth is a anthropologist at CUNY Queens who writes really, you know, has done really amazing work around time and clocks in particular. And this paper, the regular sound of the cock, is about cockerels or roosters, and he's challenging the histories of horology, so the histories of clocks, how we came to have the clocks that we have now, how they're designed, and challenging those histories for a focus on mechanical and digital devices, and thinking about all the other ways that time was told in Western culture and, well, across the globe. But in particular, the sort of historical documents that he's looking at are, you know, talking about in Romans and medieval Europe and things like this. And he points out that the roosters were actually really highly valued for telling a particular time as of just before dawn. So at that time, they tell they're very regular actually about crowing, and they're irregular the rest of the time, but at that time they're very regular. So you can use them to tell that particular time. And so the paper's really interesting for talking about how that kind of time gets dismissed. So the kind of contextual, specific, still regular and reliable time gets dismissed because there's a focus on clocks are the things that tell us the time, and all else kind of gets lost. So, and, you know, and we find this quite a lot in some of the work I've done around temporal design, which is thinking about what other kinds of ways we could design time, that when we talk to people in the workshops, you know, people have lots of examples of different objects or different people or different, you know, just really quite, you know, we ended up calling them sort of vernacular temporalities, but the things around them, the processes around them, they are using them to tell the time. But it's hidden because we assume the clock is the ultimate device and the only device actually that we tell time with. And it's a problem too, because you're not understanding the temporal relationships around you, but also then there's the exoticization of other cultures as being the ones that we can go to find out how we could tell time in more context-specific ways.
Right. That's a good point. is that problematized in the ethnographic literature? I'm thinking there's also that example of the body telling, the bodily timekeeping practices in the Pamir Mountains.
Yeah, so that was Karam Ali Kassam work that's been done on telling body clocks and telling time with the body, different parts of the body. And I mean, yeah, there's lots of, I mean, an example, I hope my partner doesn't mind me sharing this, but I love this example of the, in his family when he was a kid, they had someone who was called the time boy, so that whenever he went past the window of his house, that would tell him that he was going to be late for school, basically. So he had to leave before the time boy came past in order to get to school on time. You know, so there's lots of, those are the kinds of things I'm really interested in kind of uncovering is these vernacular temporalities again, but although this is not some not aberration, but this is something that we're doing all the time, actually.
So I guess this question about whether time is graspable or not, it really only matters to the extent that it offers analytical opportunities, distinct ones. And I wonder whether we can kind of trace approaches to time that are more about contextualized time, situated time, and if that is a means to tune our perceptions of time more in line with environment.
Yeah, well, so I mean, something I sort of been going back to recently is Anna Singh's discussion in the very beginning of the her mushroom book, where she's talking about the arts of noticing. And one of the very first things she says there is that that we need to change our conceptions of time. You know, like a fundamental possibility for the arts of noticing is this challenging of our conceptions of time and the way that we think about time. So there, you know, even prior to developing these arts of noticing, is thinking about what kind of experience of time are we talking about? How are we treating it? So I suppose, you know, that's something that sort of for me is really important, and particularly her work then with Elaine Garn. There's a really nice paper that they've written about how things hold, where they're talking about time as its forms of coordination, and they're quite interested, you know, they're saying there's a lot of work about how things fall apart, but it's also important in these times to learn how things hold. And one of the things that, you know, I've been working on and that you can see really clearly in that paper as well is this idea of time as relationship making and adjusting and you know, tweaking and fixing and remaking. That time is central to that work of maintaining relationships, forming new ones, avoiding ones that are difficult for you. So that, I mean, for me, that's really sort of the crux of why you might want to think about time as you know, think about vernacular temporalities, think about the ways that we make time with others, because it's central to relationships. It's you know, it's a making of relationships, and if relationships need to be made differently, as we know that they do need to be made differently now, then rethinking our temporal relationships is a fundamental part of that.
And has there been a move in your work on this? Because I'm thinking in 2012, you wrote this article, Fatally Confused, where you mentioned the example that, or, you know, in terms of like, we need new ways to think time because of dealing with the threat of climate change. And you mentioned this article about leatherback turtles and how following their trajectory might be a really evocative way to see the temporality of climate change. But in that example, the turtle is an indice, right? It's a way to gauge forms of time through the animal. In your more recent work on multi-species knots of entangled times, is there more of a kind of coexistence approach? Is it more about inhabiting the time along with others?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting question, actually, because I hadn't thought about how things might be changing along there, but I mean, in that paper, Fatally Confused, I guess I was quite interested in how, you know, there's lots of discussion about us being out of joint, the time going haywire, and the clock is this thing that sort of promises us that if you keep to the clock time, everything will go as it should. You know, it promises this coordination, but that it's, you know, sort of utterly failing us, and how else might we think about the clock? And you know, having worked with Donna Haraway's ideas a lot, I really was, you know, and ideas of figuration. I was very interested in her description of a figuration as a condensed map of contested worlds, and was thinking about what would be a condensed clock of contested worlds. Why does it need to be a map? What kinds of figurations might lead us into more complicated worlds? Think about temporality in more complex ways. And so the leatherback turtles, there was a scientific, I think it was in a magazine about leatherbacks showing us the complications of climate change, telling us the time of climate change quite well and how fast it was moving, which is quite interesting because turtles often, you know, symbolize slow time for us, tortoises, and perhaps more than turtles. But that, you know, it was being used as a figure to tell that we could tell time differently. So rather than a cesium atom that we use in atomic clocks, how might you, what kind of time would a turtle clock tell? And so, I mean, I'd have to think more about, is it a sort of an indices? Like, is it being used as a tool, I suppose, rather than thinking about our relationships with them? So I think maybe the chapter that is in the extinction studies, now what's the name of the time, death, and oh gosh, I can't remember the rest of the subtitle, that Debbie Redrose and Tom Van Doren and Matt Chalou edited. I have a chapter in there that's another take on the leatherback, the leatherback turtles, which is much more relational time, I think, about how time is given in relationship. So yeah, no, I think there is then this I mean, partly what I'm interested in, maybe indices of time, I suppose, or I'm trying to think of the name that comes up in metrology, but that when you think about regular clocks, the material that is used to form the basis of these clocks is the search is for something that reacts to nothing, basically, that doesn't react to heat, that doesn't react to moisture. Even, you know, it's protected, so it's not affected by gravitational waves. It's not affected by, you know, lots of different kinds of things. So the basis of the dominant, our dominant way of telling time is not reacting to anything around it, non-responsiveness. So those are the quartz, you know, and cesium and other things. They're helpful because they don't respond. So I think thinking about what else could we, you know, what does that mean? What kind of problems arise from that? What if we told time through something that was responsive to what was going on around, that adjusted, that shifted, that rethought what was going on and what kind of times might be needed in the present? So that was partly also what I thought turning to the leatherback instead might be really helpful for.
So Leonor, you're a historian, but you're somewhat unconventional at that, I guess. You're working on the co-production of time and space in your project. And I guess you might have some different ideas for how and why it matters to think time contextually or in situated ways.
Yeah, to me, I'm very happy to come across Michelle's article on the leatherbacks, because I thought it was a very obvious or very sort of easy to follow attempt to get this question of intangibility, or and especially the idea of, or the very concept of a clock or a calendar as such. I think, or this is also what you there, I think, show, and what this conversation sort of points out is a very sort of obvious example of an attempt to make time into something transcendent and universal and something that is ahistorical. And history obviously is another form of time in which that is very much situated and very politically charged in many ways. And so the way I came across this problem is I work on a major land reclamation, or the history of a major land reclamation scheme in the Netherlands, in which about 180 hectares of new land from water were produced over 60 years, starting in the 1920s. And the notion that sort of derives from this, that land can be new and can be empty and functions as this sort of blank canvas for engineers to sort of to very physically play out their planning scenarios on. And there I was sort of trying to grapple with this question of what does it mean to declare a certain space empty? I mean, that is a notion, an imaginary that is deeply rooted in colonial ideas of space, of uninhabited space or unproductive space. And I found that much of this is also based on a claim that it is ahistorical. It has no history, and therefore it's sort of an opportunity for civilization to come in and press play on what is then considered history. So there's a lot of intellectual politics involved here, I would say, or in sort of intellectualization of a political time tool. If I'm making sense, and especially, notions of progress and modernity play a really big role here and have very physical consequences. A sort of new space as sort of a geographical logic of the not yet. It's empty, and it's a sort of projection screen, right? How can we sort of use this as an entry point into that time-space discussion that sort of keeps coming up, especially if you, as a relatively young or as a PhD student, start to sort of read up on all these discussions and the idea of planetary scales that don't match, and picking up on the discussion before where sort of the very small seemingly unimportant action of starting your car somehow can blow into massive proportions on a scale that we cannot even grapple with. And I don't think there's a straight answer here, but reading more and more into the abstract time discussion didn't really seem to help me to understand the politics of, or the situatedness of these conceptions of time. And so I started reading into geography, because I thought, okay, maybe then I need to think about space. Maybe that's where the answers are, because space apparently seems to be this thing that is tangible as opposed to time, right? And it turns out that geographers what I sort of notice is that historians tend to think about geographers as a sort of a very, very different way of doing scholarship with regards to their understanding of temporal and spatial domains, and sort of and how to think about time and space, and I was kind of I was very happy to find that there is actually quite a lot of scholarship, or there's very early onwards geographers do the very opposite of shifting or putting space and time into these very different categories, quite like Michelle was talking about in terms of relationality. And David Harvey obviously is a very prominent example of someone who, after Lucien Febvre, proposed space as a fundamentally relational category. It is defined, our understanding or what it means or what certain spaces do to us. It's fundamentally defined by the relation to other spaces or what other spaces are not, right? Dreams, symbols, projections, imaginations, it's all dependent on other imaginations. And so space or a place, if you will, is very much a process. It is continuously becoming. And so David Harvey says about this in 2004 in his beautiful paper called Space as a Key Word. The concept of space is embedded in or internal to processes. The very formulation implies that, as in the case of relative space, it is impossible to disentangle space. He basically argues that this makes discussing space in isolation equally unproductive as trying to investigate time exclusively as something that is essentially abstract, without acknowledging its spatial situatedness and its positionality its geographical embeddedness, if you will. So this notion of acknowledging time or temporality to space is also a discussion that has been going on since the 90s about globalization and modernization as well. And someone who's been really prominent in the discussion is a geographer, Doreen Massey, and also Johannes Fabian is not a geographer. He's an anthropologist who also makes similar arguments here that I think might help us to think along with the question of what is at stake here. What is to try to understand what is the agenda behind maintaining this notion of transcendent, abstract time and apolitical time, if you will, So Doreen Massey she was a geographer and also an activist who argues about modernity that she then read about as globalization. She wrote this beautiful little booklet. It's a lecture I think she gave already in 1998. It's called Power Geometries of Space-Time, which says quite a lot about how this understanding of modern time or modernity as a phenomenon is the outcome of progress is very much rooted in a specific space as opposed to another. Where she argues that about modernity as globalization and also as a generalization, or rather a very powerful organization of a particular temporal experience that, and I quote here, that it enabled the establishment and universalization of particular theoretical and conceptual frames, which in turn underpinned the material reinforcement of certain ways of organizing both society and space, end of quote. She then also continues to conclude that, quote again, one of the effects was the establishment of a particular power-knowledge relation, which was mirrored in a geography. So even though time and space are the biggest domains and categories to think with, I think this shows that there's a lot of cross-contamination between these sort of intellectual exercises of understanding time as basically as an infrastructure to enable to understand certain realities, and if a certain infrastructure doesn't allow for other realities to be understood in the first place or to be noticed, then yeah, it has very material and political consequences, I think.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
there's that nice paper by Val Plumwood about shadow places. And then you sort of wonder how would you think about the shadow times, all the kinds of times that are lived that enable, a more dominant experience of time. So Sarah Sharma writes about that, and there's that nice paper from Bruno Latour and Trains of Thought where he talks a lot about sometimes the suffering of others enables this particular experience of abstract time that only certain people can experience, really. So unpacking those kinds of things, I think, is quite important. And I guess what's really interesting for me is how much of that has happened in geography around space, and how, it has been done in relation to time, but it's not consolidated, or it just kind of slips away, and it has to be rediscovered again and again. And I think, to just bring it back to the environmental humanities more specifically, I suppose, of one of the core tasks of rethinking our concepts and thinking about them in a more than human way, thinking about them outside of the humanist framework that they've come into, then, time is one of these core obviously one of these core issues that needs to do that way of thinking, but maybe doesn't have the same kind of resources around it the spaces have in order to think it through that way, because of this idea that it's ingraspable and intangible.
Yeah, and I think I'm going to take in a question now, because I think that it is kind of pertinent to this discussion. It's from Rémi Gandoin. Apologies if I pronounced that wrongly.
Yeah, do put questions in there if you have any.
Yes, and so he's wondering, how much has the physical concept of space-time influenced the discussions and reflections about the human conceptions of space and time that are not space-time that you mentioned? Thanks, Remy. And I do think that gets to kind of the paradox of why space-time has been a concept in the physical sciences for like 100 years or something, and a scheme for handling relativity is really old there. But I don't think, space as a key word is the first time that I can think of that analogy is taken head on in an effort to create a matrix for how to understand space and time as conjoined. It really doesn't seem like it's formed part of like the academic routine, if you will, in the same way that spatial analysis or analyses of the production of space have set foot in the human geography field.
Well, I mean, I think one of the problems that I see is this the idea that to understand time, you either go to physics or you go to philosophy. And that keeps coming up again and again, that when you ask this question of time, it's the physicists who have the answer, or the philosophers, so either continental or the philosophers who are thinking about the science of time or the physics of time. And there's so many other disciplines, I think, that can give us much more interesting, to be honest, approaches to thinking about time, if I'm not being too challenging there. I mean, anthropology and sociology, for example, and all the work that they've done on social time and time as a form of power and control, and the kind of things I've been talking about, relationality already. I think you get a much clearer view of time in that sense if you look at anthropology and sociology. But somehow there's this idea that physicists and philosophers have the handle on what the fundamental metaphysics of what time really is, but I don't think that's really true. One of the things I'm quite interested in more recently is thinking about phenology, which is the understandings of timing in plants and animals that comes from ecology. And I think this might be quite interesting to think about in contrast to the geological approach to time that you also see is very influential in environmental humanities, which, as I think we saw from the conversation previously with Chakrabarti, that it seems to, or for all the wonderful things that you can get from an understanding of time from geology, in environmental humanities, it's narrowed debates down a lot to questions about chronology. So that there's lots of really important things that are being said there about time, but the conversation keeps returning to where do we put the starting point, and what the implications of that are. And so unpacking what those implication points are really important, but to keep returning back to this chronology, narrowing time in that kind of way, I think is quite problematic. And what I think is quite interesting about phonology as an alternative is not an alternative that dismisses it, but in addition, is that it helps us to think about how time is made through adjustments and relationships with what is helpful, with things that you might want to avoid. All this kind of negotiation. Time is a form of negotiation, rather than time as sort of sedimentary layers or a chronology that you might get from geology. So what might having a conversation with ecologists open up for how we understand time in environmental humanities is something I'm quite interested in.
And you also...
So, I don't know if I just completely... So this is why I haven't been talking about space-time, I suppose, is that quite often when you do talk about, you get theories of relativity and you get Einstein and all the rest of it. But I think I'm quite sympathetic with Bergson's, the problems that he had with Einstein, that it's that who is it that's viewing the clock is a really important question of how time's situated. I won't go into that too much though.
But you do also work by analogy to space sometimes, I've noticed. When you're searching for this notion of temporal belonging that would be analogous to what place is with respect to space. Do you want to elaborate on that a little bit? Just because I think it's a nice little thought.
Yeah, well, I'd come across this quote from Yves Tuan, who's a quite well-known geographer who sort of talked about, I think I wrote down the quote here about, as we come to know space better, what begins as undifferentiated space becomes place as we get to know it better and endow it with value. And I was quite curious about what was the time version of that, I suppose. What begins as undifferentiated time becomes what? And I asked this on Twitter, and there was lots of different answers, but there wasn't any clear answer of what our understanding of sort of an in-placed, well-known time is. When you've lived somewhere for a couple of years and you start to understand why things happen when they do, and when you should do the things that you should do. I'm looking at my raspberries right now, and I've learned with my raspberries I need to pick them every 2 days, or else the flies get onto them and there's grubs all through them. And I only know that because I've lived here long enough to have this relationship with them to figure out the best time for me to pick the raspberries. And it is interesting because my background is in continental philosophy, and so many times there in Bergson and Heidegger, and there's this distaste for the spatial metaphor of how we destroy time by turning it into this spatial metaphor. But actually the work, I find it absolutely fascinating to read things in critical cartography, for example, and replace the word map with clock and think about, could the kinds of claims they're making about maps apply to clocks? Or just think about the approaches that have been developed in space and human geography. I think it's just a shame that this spatialization of time that's supposed to be this really horrible, evil thing that takes us away from what time is, has got such a bad rap in some ways, because it's really fascinating, and it opens up lots of different kinds of questions, I think, to then trying to avoid it altogether.
Yeah, and I think I remember you discussing that example previously. We also started talking about sort of the globalization of European seasonality, right? The idea of putting up a Christmas tree in Australia in July, but it's summer. During Christmas, but it's summer outside. So I think these everyday experiences are a real way to kind of to see how temporal orders are kind of weirdly spread out in space.
Yeah, and how they can become very colonial. That attempt in Australia to implement Northern European seasons in a country where they just really don't fit, and all the consequences that has had. But there's also really interesting things too about how the land and the environment sort of push back against that in some ways. I'm thinking there's a really nice paper by Christine Hansen on deep time and fire that's in the Environmental Humanities Journal, where she talks about bushfire seasons challenging European ideas of staying in place, of land ownership and things like that. So there's also, attempts to colonize the land by applying these temporal vernaculars from another place, but how, and there's pushback on that. How could we understand those kinds of issues more deeply too?
Now, I know that our wonderful host has a question for us.
Yeah, thank you so much for this discussion. I really enjoyed listening in. I just wanted to circle back a little bit to Dipesh Chakrabarty's talk as well, and which you were sort of talking a little bit about, Michelle, this notion of the planet as an emergent humanist category, which of course is a spatial concept, but also a temporal concept in many ways, encompassing all these different scales. But it has emerged very much through the geosciences, earth system science. So I think maybe you could elaborate a little bit more on what role this kind of critical time studies can play in kind of conceptualizing this new object, the planet as a humanist category, if that makes sense. Like, where do you see the role for these kinds of critical time studies?
Let me think. I haven't brought those two things together, I suppose, trying to think through the planetary, because I guess I'm really interested in, the kinds of temporal vernaculars that we've been talking about already. There's one thing that sort of comes to mind that's really interesting, it actually came from a video on phonology where I think it's Mark Schmidt is talking about the plants in our own gardens, and how if you're a phonologist and you're keeping track of the kinds of changes and when they flower or leaf out, they can actually tell you, they're actually indicating to you of global warming. So it was quite interesting. He was basically saying, again, this idea of climate change and global warming being intangible. We often talk about that too, that, it's formed by an algorithm, and that's where it is. And so it's not something that we can touch. Whereas he was talking about how, in everybody's backyard, actually, the flowers that you touch and that you live with, because of the changes that are happening with them, they can actually tell you about these planetary temporalities as well. And so I think that we did talk about this a little bit in our PhD seminar, and there were some really interesting questions about the role of record keeping, because partly you notice that the flowers are different because you've been keeping records from year to year about when they come out or not. That's the kind of thing I'm interested in, actually, is, and it's a similar thing with the unexpected encounters with deep time, the way that deep time happens when you look at the floor of a hotel lobby and you see a fossil in the middle of this floor, and that the lilacs maybe can tell you the time of global warming and climate change. Is that sort of that juxtaposition and the feeling of being thrown out of your sense of time. The leatherbacks do this too. People who encounter them don't know what time they're in because they seem like they're some dinosaur animal. What are they doing here in this place? So the way that these different kinds of times cut into each other and give this sense of disorientation, I think is quite an interesting way to think about it.
So I just wanted to pitch in something from my own work. I think, I see this.
Time is running out. I'm afraid.
Oh, dare.
Yeah.
Sorry, Emil.
Sorry.
No, that's fine.
Here, but yeah, we are running out of time.
Okay.
But thank you so much.
Thanks, Eric, for keeping us to time too.
Yes.
Yeah, the timekeeping is strong. Yeah. But
I
thank
really
you so much for this discussion, and we will take a short break now, and we'll be back in a few minutes with Greta Gard and Sverker Selin talking about COVID-19 and the environmental humanities. So we'll see you in a bit. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.
Have a good evening.
Thanks.